Well, my name is Kul Gautam, former UNICEF Deputy Executive Director, spent 35 years in this organization in many different places, happily retired now. And during my UNICEF career, I neglected my own children while taking care of the world's children. So now I'm compensating for it by taking care of my grandchildren. That's what I do. That's my new job, taking care of the grandchildren. And in 1989, you asked me where was I? I was right here at UNICEF, orchestrating the Convention on the Rights of the Child and preparing for the World Summit for Children, the largest gathering of world leaders in history until that time. Well, my hope for the next 30 years is that in the last 30 years, we have come a long way. As I look back to 1989 and the situation of children at that time, many things have improved. Children live longer, they go to school for a longer period, they have better quality education, they are better protected. So in many ways, these have been the wonderful 30 years for children. Yet, in some ways, there has also been some retrogression. Problems that did not exist at that time have become very big. HIV/AIDS was just beginning at that time. It became a huge issue, and now luckily it is being tackled. Now you find diseases like Ebola, which did not exist, becoming a big issue now. Something whole completely new, the digital world, and how children now, on the positive side, are glued to the world, very well connected, taking advantage of the internet, but also the black side of the internet. Children are being exploited online, including sexual exploitation of children. Problems that we did not even imagine they would be there. The framers of the Convention on the Rights of the Child had no imagination that there would be such new problems. So I hope that in the next 30 years, we will finish with some of the big problems that were there in 1989 and tackle some of the new problems that are plaguing the children of the world today. Well, I would say that there is a slight exaggeration when people say UNICEF resisted the Convention on the Rights of the Child in the 1980s. That is not entirely true. That is half true. The fact is, to understand UNICEF's position vis-à-vis the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we need to go back to the history of the Convention. Remember, the whole idea of the Convention started right after the First World War, when Eglantin Jebb, the leader of Save the Children in the UK, came up with the idea that the world needed to protect the children and they needed to have rights. So, in fact, it was in 1924 that the League of Nations adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. And since then, many organizations have been campaigning to make it a convention, not just a declaration for the rights of the child. Remember when the declaration was adopted? UNICEF did not even exist. UNICEF was founded in 1946, long after the declaration. But the founders of UNICEF were very inspired by the ideals of the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. So they were very committed to the idea of a convention. But UNICEF was a very practical organization, very action-oriented organization. We were working in many disaster-prone countries, providing relief supplies and action there. There was not enough time to talk about convention. So our leaders were very busy acting, making a difference for children. They were supportive of the NGOs, but of the CRC, but the CRC was not at the top of their agenda. CRC was at the top of the agenda of many non-governmental organizations. They were the activists, and we were kind of backbenchers supporting them, so not very active. But come 1959, when there was the declaration adopted by the United Nations. Remember, the League of Nations adopted it in 1924. The United Nations adopted the declaration in 1959. At that time, UNICEF was very supportive of the NGOs that were promoting the Convention on the Rights of the Child at that time, the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. Then, 20 years later, 1979, was the International Year of the Child. That was the moment that the whole world mobilized for the convention. And UNICEF was right there because UNICEF was the key agency promoting and shepherding the year of the child, 1979. Then come the 1980s, the era of child survival revolution under Jim Grant. And it is true that initially Jim Grant was not as enthusiastic about the convention, but the reason was he was pushing an agenda for child survival, child health, immunization, development, and he felt that the convention did not give enough importance to these health-related issues. It was a bit too much focused on the protection issues, which are also important, but he thought that more emphasis needed to be given. So in other words, the convention, like other human rights convention, was very focused on civil and political rights, not enough on economic and social rights, like right to health, right to education. And it was Jim Grant who then in the mid-1980s said, let us make sure that the convention also has social and economic rights, child survival, development, education, water, sanitation. These issues should also be as prominent as the child protection issue. And once the framers of the convention agreed that yes, those issues should also be in the convention, UNICEF threw its weight behind it. Jim Grant was fully behind it, and thank goodness, because of Jim Grant's leadership and UNICEF throwing its weight behind, that in 1989 we managed to get the convention adopted by the General Assembly. Without UNICEF's enthusiastic support, this would not have happened. So it was from the mid-1980s that Jim Grant threw his weight, the organization's weight, and the convention picked up momentum, and in 1989 it was adopted. Well, I would say that until the mid-1980s, the convention, as it was being formulated, was a subject of big debate at the United Nations, also at the UNICEF Executive Board, and among NGOs everywhere. It was not yet a big issue in UNICEF field offices. It was a big issue in the national committees, in the rich country, industrialized countries. And part of the reason why Jim Grant was a little reluctant to put his full weight behind it is he felt that, this Convention on the Rights of the Child, it will never come into being during my lifetime, he thought. It is a wonderful thing, we should support it, but it's going to take a long time. So right now I should focus on saving children's lives, immunizing them, providing them education, water and sanitation, practical actions. The convention will come later because it is not likely to happen during my lifetime. But when he saw two things, one, UNICEF field offices also started getting excited. Two, national committees of UNICEF in all the industrialized countries were getting very excited, and there was pressure. So in 1986, I remember we prepared a first ever UNICEF's official board document on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That document, interestingly, was crafted by Bakir Namazi, one of our colleagues, an Iranian fellow who unfortunately today is under house arrest in Iran, and we are all trying to get him released. He was one of the masterminds at the 1986 board report. Then when Jim Grant saw that, no, this convention is not going to take such a long time, we can, if we put our weight behind it, we can get it adopted in my lifetime, not in my children's lifetime. Then he threw his weight behind it. He made sure that issues related to health, education, sanitation, nutrition, those were also as prominent as child protection. So it became a more complete convention, both civil and political rights and economic and social rights. And then he threw his weight behind it. The whole of UNICEF was mobilized and organized, and then, as I said, the momentum picked up for it to be adopted unanimously by the UN General Assembly on the 20th of November 1989. Yes, indeed. When excited by the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Jim Grant became even more ambitious. He said, this convention is not easy to implement. There are such ambitious ideas, rights. Some of those rights, 100 years from now, when we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we'll still have issues that are not fully implemented, because the Convention is framed in such terms as it's very idealistic, certain things. For example, the Convention talks about the achieving the highest standard of health for children. Well, highest standards, we'll always be striving for that, as I say, even 50, 100 years from now. And we saw that in the Convention, it says in Article 4, when it comes to social and economic rights, they are to be achieved progressively to the maximum extent of available resources for developing countries and with the support of international cooperation. That's a wonderful statement, but that is also an escape valve. When you say, are you doing to the maximum extent of your ability? Many poor countries say, yeah, we are doing the maximum possible, but sorry, we don't have enough resources, we cannot fully implement the Convention, it is too ambitious. Jim Grant and all of us wanted to make sure that they were not running away by saying, we are poor, we cannot implement. We wanted to say every country can implement it, whether you are poor or rich. But to be realistic, we needed to set some goals. Goals that were ambitious but achievable. Achievable not in 100 years, but in 10 years or 5 years. So that they are realistic. So developing countries cannot say, oh, we are going to need billions of dollars, we don't have this money, we cannot implement the Convention. Not to give them an excuse. And also to encourage the rich countries to contribute. So we said, let's come up with some goals that are achievable. So that's how we had extensive consultation with UNICEF, WHO, all the UN agencies. What can be achieved in the next 10 years? So we came up with a number of goals. I said, can this be achieved even in poor countries? Yes. Do we have enough resources? Yes. Do we have the technology? Yes. So there is no excuse not to implement them. So that's how we started formulating the goals. And indeed, there were other economic development goals, trade-related goals in the world the UN had adopted starting in the 1960s. But for the first time in 1989-90, at the time of the Summit for Children, we formulated very clear, ambitious 27 goals, 7 big ones, 20 supporting goals that were achievable. And that was indeed the beginning of the goal setting. Until that time, it was said that at the UN, goals are ever set but never met. We don't want that to happen. We want these goals to be implemented. So not only we formulated the goals, we required all countries to prepare a national plan of action to implement those goals in your country, to allocate adequate resources. And we also devised a very strong system of monitoring to hold the countries accountable. And the UN and the UNICEF was given a particular responsibility to monitor, to report to the UN General Assembly, are they doing the right kind of job? So it was indeed the beginning of setting goals, ambitious goals, measurable goals, time-bound goals for children, which later on became actually the foundation for the Millennium Development Goals. It was the Summit for Children. And the goals we set for children at that time in 1990, that were the first time that the United Nations adopted goals that were measurable, achievable, time-bound. And indeed, in the 1990s, we made fantastic progress for children. And it was encouraged by the progress that was made and the good monitoring system that Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General of the UN, when he organized the Millennium Summit, said, what kind of goals should we set? He looked to UNICEF. He looked to children. You guys have done it. You have achieved goals. You have set goals. You have established monitoring mechanisms. So that's what became the impetus for the Millennium Development Goals and subsequently even for today's Sustainable Development Goals. Oh my God, there were enormous challenges because...
Sorry, could you start with at the World Summit?
Yeah. In 1990, when we organized the World Summit for Children, which was the largest gathering of world leaders in history until that time. Since then, there have been bigger summits, but that was the very first World Summit. World Summit meaning summit that had leaders from east and west, north and south, rich and poor countries, everywhere. And organizing such a summit was an unprecedented event in the history of the United Nations. So it was the first time we were organizing, and we faced enormous challenges. First, the challenge of getting world leaders to focus on children. Many people said, why would world leaders talk about little babies and kids? World leaders talk about more important things like war and peace and trade and commerce. Children are not something that world leaders would be interested in. That was the perception. We proved them wrong. In fact, Jim Grant said, world leaders, if they talk about war and peace and trade and commerce, they will never come to an agreement. But if we talk about children, they will unite. So it was a genius idea. So indeed, instead of getting just the first ladies or the minister of social affairs or health or education, we actually had 71 heads of state and heads of government at that time. So getting them was a challenge, but we got them. Organizing them, even the logistics of how do you get the leaders to the UN was a huge challenge. And if you want to know about how big a challenge it was, you can see some description in my book, where I talk about the challenge of organizing the Summit for Children. Third challenge was getting them to agree on an agenda, on the goals. Because every country had their own favorite goals, and there were certain goals that we wanted to push, the UNICEF and some countries, and many countries did not agree. Guess what? One of the most contentious issues, unfortunately, became the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which had just been adopted by unanimously at the UN. Because some countries, including this one here, the United States, did not want to subscribe to the convention. So why should the convention be given so importance? We had to mobilize a lot of support from civil society, governments to make sure that the convention remained top of the agenda. So in the 10-point declaration of the Summit for Children, indeed, ratification, universal ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child was the first item. That required a lot of dealings. Then there were other issues that come always at the UN that are complicated. If you talk about family planning or reproductive health, that becomes always controversial. About children under occupation in Palestine, etc., in the UN, it's always very political. But we need to deal with all children. Then there were issues of, okay, you agree to all these ambitious goals. Where is the money? How are you going to implement it? Can we get some commitment for more aid, maybe debt relief for children? Many countries were supporting that, civil society, UNICEF, but some countries were opposed to that. So we had to overcome all of those challenges, and we did. In the end, we had a magnificent declaration, 10-point declaration, and a plan of action. And I was lucky enough to be the key member drafting that plan of action, along with Ambassador Hans Dahlgren of Sweden, who drafted the declaration. So we were a duo, Hans Dahlgren and Kul Gautam drafting the declaration and plan of action. And indeed, that became a historic occasion when this declaration, as you said, on the survival, development, and protection of children was adopted. And it was not only adopted, more than 100 countries prepared national programs of action to implement them. Good implementation happened, very good monitoring happened, and that is what, as I said, gave a tremendous boost to setting goals globally. And when 10 years later, the Millennium Summit was held, among all the goals that the world leaders agreed to in the year 2000, the inspiration of the 1990 Summit for Children was the most important. So most of the MDGs were about children, their health, their education, their sanitation, their nutrition, their protection. So I think UNICEF and those who are championing the Convention on the Rights of the Child can take great pride that they have influenced the shaping of the world's development agenda, MDGs first, and today's sustainable development later. Well, people like yourself, the young generation who are the children of the convention era, the era after the Summit for Children, you must realize that your predecessors in this organization have established a fantastic foundation. This is one of the strongest organizations, the most respected organization. You are lucky to be working at UNICEF, and that UNICEF, of all the UN agencies, commands the great respect all over the world. So it is a privilege to work for such an organization, but our work is so important, and there are times when one can be easily frustrated. When you see children in war, when you see children in epidemics, when you see children being victimized with cyber crime and, as I say, sexual exploitation, all kinds of modern forms of exploitation, it is easy to be discouraged. You may think that, oh, things are so much harder today than they were in the past. The past must have been easy. Not true. The past was more difficult. The task today is much simpler, easier, because you have fantastic access to communications technology. You can reach everybody. Children are better educated. So I think the task is slightly easier than it was during the time of your predecessors. But new problems will arise. Climate change, we were hardly aware of climate change, a big issue before the 1989. That has become a big issue. But not only has it become a big issue, it has also become a big mobilizing power. And who is providing the strongest leadership on climate change? Greta Thunberg, young people. So this is the era of young people who can assert themselves, who can change the world far more than in the previous generation. So young people today, young staff members of UNICEF have incredible opportunities to influence the shape of the future of humanity. So I would say that young people, younger staff members of UNICEF should be enthusiastic, should be ambitious, never give up. Your predecessors have done things, extraordinary things. Remember, UNICEF got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1965, which means that we were doing fantastic work then. But we must continue to do that work, because the work for children is not finished. It will never be finished. Remember, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we are celebrating 30 years and now lamenting that many rights are not implemented. Even 100 years from now, some of the rights will not be fully implemented. Why? Because our ambition will become higher. What we think like, wow, if we could achieve such and such goals today, we would be so happy. At that time, the future generation would have greater ambitions. And we want to build a better future. So the work for children is never ending, but the quality of life of children can be improved, is being improved, and I think your generation of people can make the lives of children far, far more better, consistent with the ideals of the Convention on the Rights of the Child than was the case with the previous generation. So the work is cut out for the younger generation. It is easier, but equal determination is needed. In the 1990s, after the Summit for Children and the Convention, one of the greatest innovations that we made in the 1990s in UNICEF's programming, country programming, was that we adopted a child rights-based approach to programming. Until that time, we talked about the needs of children. Poor children, cute little children, we need to love them, we need to hug them, we need to provide them these kind of services out of love and charity alone. What happened in the 1990s is that it is not only our love and passion and compassion for children, it is their rights according to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we adopted a rights-based framework, and that has served UNICEF well. But as you said, today there are many forces in the world that are not as supportive of the rights-based approach. But this is a passing phenomenon. Don't be pessimistic. You know, in the history of humanity, we go through ups and downs. You go 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. And right now, when you see threats to rights and the rights-based approach, you might feel very discouraged that the world is going backwards. No, it is just a blip. That we will overcome that. That, you know, what is good and right and proper for humanity is always going to win. and the rights-based approach is there to survive. It will survive, it will thrive. We must not give up. Yes, there are challenges. Right now, there are some significant challenges on issues of climate change, on issues of sexual and reproductive rights, on some of the child protection issues. But don't give up, and don't be discouraged by a few backsliding, some countries, some leaders that are not enthusiastic today. They may seem very powerful today, but the real power lies in what is the best interest of children, because ultimately everybody is going to come around to what is in the best interest of children, and the best interest of children are child rights and child well-being. That agenda will never go away. It will never be powerless. It will always be the agenda that will unite humanity. So I would not be pessimistic. Just acknowledge that there will be challenges from time to time, and right now is one of those periods where we face a little difficulties, but we will overcome.